I'm here in central London in Fleet Street today, the former hub of the press, to ask members of the public what they think about the media and how it deals with different tiers of society. So let's hear what they had to say. When you hear the word terrorist in a sentence, what's the first thought that comes to mind?
Bombs causing havoc, killing people. Well, I'm a history student, so loads of different responses. Maybe IRA would come into my mind. Or obviously in the media, the stereotypical terrorist is a Muslim extremist. So those are two ones that come into my mind.
My first thought is going to be there's a stigma attached to terrorism. It's going to be the idea of terrorism is thinking about extremism, thinking about far right, far left. In today's society, the stereotype would be around, obviously, the idea of Islam being connected to terrorism. Personally, I would say it's not the case that there is maybe a direct link between terrorism and Islam, and also is that terrorism can come from within any religion, any culture, any identity.
Do you think the Western media has an Islamophobic agenda?
Possibly. My best friend is Muslim, and he says a lot of people look at him strangely.
Whether I know if it's on the agenda for the media to create this idea of Islamophobia, I'm not sure. Does it exist? Definitely. Do people look at Muslims in a different way than they would to other people? Definitely. The stereotype is there.
I don't think the media necessarily has an Islamophobic agenda. I think a lot of what is said and the way it's portrayed is definitely Islamophobic in nature. Whether there's an agenda under that, I probably don't think so.
What do you think the man who killed 6 people in Arizona should be labelled as?
A terrorist.
It depends whether he was motivated for political reasons or anything. I think a terrorist is someone who's motivated politically or religiously. So, no, I think that any man would be labelled a murderer by the majority of those who read the story.
Leon, were you surprised by any of those reactions?
I wasn't surprised, but I think I would say I was encouraged. And I think what we can take from that is something quite optimistic, which is that even though we do know that in the media there is a lot of demonisation, biased reporting and stereotyping, the public in general, we need to give them a bit of credit that a lot of people, like the young guys in that clip, they're able to decipher these stereotypes and this misleading reporting, and they're able to see beyond it, and they know that, you know, the media is sort of biased and playing a game. So that's something I think positive we can take. The audiences are not as passive as some people might make out.
I must say that we are encouraged all the time by the people who we interview in London, but London is probably has one of the better informed communities in Britain.
I would exactly going to make that point, that those people were obviously quite aware, quite well educated and very articulate. You cannot say that that's going to be repeated up and down the country in every corner of Britain.
I think you can actually, to be honest with you. I think it's quite London-centric to assume that outside of London, people who are watching the media can't decipher these messages. I wasn't talking about London. Because in Manchester we're also educated, and
a lot of people are very cynical.
The rest of the country.
No, I don't mean London. I'm saying.
But British people in general, I think we have to accept British people in general are open-minded people, and they're willing to decipher these messages.
Well, it's an interesting point, but if I can bring Ben in, I mean, how would you account for the extraordinary rise of the English Defence League, this far-right group who do seem to peddle Islamophobia?
Well, I think if you look at the groups like the English Defence League and the British National Party, yes, they do peddle Islamophobia, but then they also peddle xenophobia in many different forms. I mean, you know, there's a very strong movement against Europeans, a very strong movement against immigrants of any kind, of any racial
So where
background.
is this hate coming from? Who's fueling it? Because they weren't around 5 years ago.
No, I think, as I said before, the elephant in the room really is 9/11. Post 9/11, the media had an agenda, or had the ability, to push fear, I think, in many cases. Yes, there is a terrorist threat, there's no doubt about it, but the level of response in the media to that terrorist threat has been incredibly significant. And I think that's why people now associate Muslims with terrorists. And before that, it would be much more likely that everyone in that clip, although I think there was one person, but everyone in that clip would have said terrorist IRA.
Okay, but I think that's a fair point, Ben. But you see, the real elephant in the room, if I may say so, is the level of education of the population as a whole and the awareness of people about issues, say international issues as a whole. It's okay to say that 9/11 changed everything and bigger, but anybody who had taken an intelligent interest and is aware of the issues can see beyond the government agendas, saw behind the motivation for the Iraq War and so on and so forth, and we don't swallow and buy everything that government say.
The media played a huge part in that.
No, very small.
I think there was a huge amount of critique against the Iraq War.
People went for it in a big way. The media went for it in a big way.
2 million people protesting in London.
That's true, but the media.
Let me put you on the spot, Salim. You worked for the BBC. Yes. Of course, it's purely a speculation, but if 9/11 had never happened, would the BBC have still banned the DEC appeal for the children of Gaza?
Yes, I think they would. I think that historically the BBC has always taken a position on the Israeli-Palestine conflict which claims to be balanced and neutral, but actually gives the Israeli case more weight than it necessarily merits if you look at the legal cases, international legal kind of disputes around it and UN resolutions. How
damaging do you think that incident was to the BBC when they refused to run that appeal for the children of Gaza?
Well, actually at the time, because I think I was still at the BBC when it happened, and it was immensely damaging, even within the BBC. A lot of people were blogging internally about it. And on that point, you'd be very surprised at how right-wing some of the blogging in the BBC's internal bulletin boards is. But no, I think it was damaging at the time. But to come back to my point, you see, about education and awareness, these are the real issues. If we do not have a population as a whole which is well enough educated about international affairs to look beyond the headlines, to look beyond the propaganda, whoever is pushing that propaganda, then people can get away with it. People did protest about the Iraq War, 2 million people. It did not change the government's attitude, and the press were not that supportive of it at the time.
No, I think the press certainly did take a very stringent response to the government's decision in Iraq, to the extent that actually they probably overstated their brief in the case of the Daily Mirror and printed some false evidence as to Iraqi prisoner abuse. Nevertheless, across the media spectrum,
once we were already there. We're talking about...
Well, no, sure, but it's the whole process. You've got...
In the run-up to the war, when the press and the media should have been asking critical questions about the government, what's really going on here, why are we going into Iraq, which has no connection with 9/11, nobody in the media was really asking those questions. They went along with what was said.
How did the 2 million people know about what the 2 million people?
Because as Leon said, not everybody buys.
Yeah, absolutely, but that's right? Part of the media digest,
which would support your citizen journalism argument.
Absolutely,
but what about the stories that were planted in the media? I mean, I think everybody accepts that Saddam was a brutal dictator, not a person to be crossed. But there were ridiculous stories about him having a people shredder where he was feeding people into a shredding machine.
I think the more important issue in Iraq was the problems with embedded journalists. I think there were very few free media journalists in Iraq in the opening of the conflict, and most journalists were embedded with a in a military context.
I mean, that's an excellent point, and the whole business of embedded journalism is probably worth another discussion. But let's head for the Agenda's electronic post room, where Mohammed Walji selects the best Facebook responses to today's topic.